There's a lot of talk about the oil price crisis coming to an end, that Trump, Russia, Saudi Arabia and OPEC are coming to some sort of agreement. However, anybody looking at the details will see that what's being negotiated is not an end to the oil price crisis, but a truce, a temporary truce, that OPEC doesn't seem too keen on and continues to be quite suspicious. And the proof of that is that OPEC is only discussing production cuts in the space of 2-3 months and then a re-evaluation of those cuts. And the reason why this is more a truce than an end to the crisis is because the issue that upset Russia, the issue that disturbed OPEC, the issue that led to Saudi Arabia flooding the market hasn't been addressed and hasn't been resolved. And that issue is the aggression with which America pursues market share. In other words, OPEC feels that every time it cuts production to bring the prices up, the US pumps more oil and comes in and takes that market share that's been vacated. And when OPEC cut production again, the US increases production and takes more of that market share. Now, the US says that because of antitrust laws, it can't abide by any production cut agreements with OPEC. However, Russia believes that this is just an excuse, and so do most of the OPEC countries, because they believe that the US uses underhanded tactics to increase the competitiveness of the US oil companies and to facilitate the US taking more market share. In other words, Russia believes that the US imposes sanctions on Rosneft and companies associated with the Nord Stream 2 project that brings gas from Siberia all the way to Europe in order to further the favorability of the market to American oil companies. Russia believes that the US gives very lenient financing and very lenient legislation to the shale oil industry to insulate it from market shocks and to increase its competitiveness. Now, Russia has reason to believe that the US aggression is getting too much. In February 2020, Pompeo went to Belarus, the first visit by a senior US official in many, many years. And in Belarus, Pompeo in front of the camera said, "We, the US, are ready to provide all of Belarus's oil needs." Now, Russia currently provides those oil needs for Belarus. So in other words, Pompeo challenged Russia there and then in front of everybody, saying we are the ones who are ready to replace Russian oil. And it's here where the problem between Russia and OPEC emerged. Russia asked Saudi Arabia and asked OPEC that any plans to cut production to bring the price up should be put on hold because it only benefits the US shale oil industry. It benefits the US companies who will come in and eat up that market share. Saudi Arabia believed that it had already tried. It's already tried to squeeze the shale oil companies. It tried in 2014 to flood the market, but the shale oil companies survived. In other words, for the US, they considered it more of a streamlining of the industry, where smaller companies went bankrupt and bigger companies would buy out those smaller companies, and therefore it would become more streamlined, the industry at least. But Russia believes that the reason Saudi Arabia buckled so quickly is because the succession struggle in Saudi Arabia meant that a lot of the competing princes needed Washington on board. So in other words, Saudi Arabia was ready to give up on flooding the market in exchange for US support at a very difficult time for the kingdom. Of course, Saudi Arabia will argue that the real reason is that the economies of the OPEC countries are going through very difficult times and they need the price at a certain level. It cannot flood the market and keep the oil prices low when some countries need $80 per barrel in order just to break even. Oil is more than a commodity. The reason why oil is such a contentious issue between the OPEC countries is that it's just a contentious issue. The US is not trying to take market share because it wants to make more money, and Saudi is not trying to protect market share because it wants to get more money. This has far more important geopolitical ramifications. For Saudi Arabia, oil is the only leverage it has against the United States. It's the only leverage it has against the world. And when you see the way that the US invaded Iraq, Saudi Arabia is wary that a cowboy president could come at any time and decide that after Iraq it's time to go to Saudi Arabia. And in fact, many believe that the only reason the US did not go or plan an invasion of Saudi Arabia is because Iraq did not go very well. And anybody who wants to add fuel to this theory need only listen to the leaked phone call between the former Qatari Prime Minister and Gaddafi, whereby the former Qatari Prime Minister states that he met with US and British officials to discuss dividing Saudi Arabia into 5 different countries. Whatever your belief with regards to this, the reality is that without oil, Saudi Arabia has no leverage against the United States. It will be unable to curb any potential US aggression. And the reason why I start with this point is because US policy on oil is driven by a never again attitude. In 1973, Saudi Arabia cut oil off from the US and it plunged the world into a recession. The reason being was that Saudi Arabia protested US support for Israel. In other words, it was a successful attempt by King Faisal at the time to strong-arm the US. And the US essentially since then has been stocking up on reserve oil to make sure that it never again becomes strong-armed by any nation outside of its borders. And this is why when we look at this oil price and the way that the measures that Saudi Arabia and OPEC are willing to go to ensure the protection of their market share, this is the real reason. It's not just economic reasons. And this is why when we see this truce that's taking place between the different countries, when we see this talk that's taking place of potential agreement of production cuts, it's not because Russia and Saudi Arabia suddenly saw eye to eye. It is because Trump has promised to cut production. Trump has promised that he will not take the market share when OPEC cut production. Trump has essentially said, guys, bring the oil price back up and I will abide by any agreement. Now, some people may be screaming about the antitrust laws. Trump said in a statement that antitrust laws do not apply because he will not be manually cutting production. Production will automatically be cut because the shale oil industry has been struggling and suffered from this recent oil price war. And the extent to which Trump is willing to go to ensure that this truce lasts for a significant period of time is that Mexico, which is arguing over the amount it should cut in terms of production, Mexico is being asked to cut more than it wants to cut. Trump has offered to help make up the revenue from lost production. In other words, Trump is very keen to get these talks going. And the fact that Trump was able to get the talks going shows that for Russia and Saudi Arabia, for Saudi Arabia at least, Russia was not the problem, and for Russia, Saudi Arabia was not the problem. The problem was US aggression. Trump has promised to ease up, and therefore there is room for agreement. But OPEC is wary, and this is why they've agreed to reevaluate the cuts after 2 or 3 months. If the US seems to be aggressive and tries to take more market share, then it may well be we will see this oil crisis resume. Now you'll notice that I haven't mentioned COVID-19 and I haven't mentioned Corona. The reason being is that COVID-19 accelerated a problem that was already there. COVID-19 did not bring about this problem. Concerns over American aggression in the oil market were there and have been there for a number of years. All COVID-19 did was, instead of this issue taking place in 2023 or 2024, it made it take place in 2020. That is the impact of COVID-19. That's in a nutshell everything you need to know about the current oil crisis. Don't forget to subscribe to The International Interest.